I've been driving this freshly rebuilt 1995 Ford Crown Victoria for quite a while now that I've gotten the engine and transmission and rear end all swapped out with the wrecked Crown Victoria that I still have. Almost done with taking all the useful parts off of the wrecked car to have as spares for the working car. And as with most cars just sold, they do have problems that come up down the road. And one of those problems that recently came up during a rainstorm is this. Window doesn't want to go up and down. And I was lucky enough that it failed in the up position, and I got it almost all the way up to where not much rain can get in here, but as you can see, the window won't go all the way up. So I know that the problem is either in the power window motor or the regulator. And as I mentioned before, I have a very handy little junkyard going on here with another car, the same kind and year, that I've been taking parts off of to have for a rainy day, so to speak. And one of those parts is stationary glass. I'm taking all the glass out of here to use just in case mine gets broken, as well as all the power window motors and regulators. And just as an example, I have one sitting out here that you can see. This is the entire power window motor and regulator assembly all complete. So you have the motor that attaches to this cable and pulley assembly, and then on the opposite side you can see the cables and how they work. And this is the right rear window motor and regulator assembly from the wrecked car with only 13,000 miles at the time it was wrecked. And you can already see through the ravages of time how these plastic pieces just tend to crack just sitting here. Stress cracks, as this plastic is molded onto this metal that's actually under some tension here, and over time it just cracks. So this regulator, even though it looks brand new and doesn't have a whole lot of use on it, there's the regulate motor part number. Just by sitting here with time, over 18 some odd years, you have stress cracks and you have grease that has dried into a wax-like consistency. And when this happens, this mechanism requires more torque from the motor. And when that happens, you start to approach the limits of what the motor is actually designed to do, because built into here are safeties that will give way if a certain amount of torque is exceeded, such that if you get your hand caught in the window, there's actually plastic gear plugs inside of here that will shear away, so the motor will just freewheel and not roll the window all the way up to pinch your fingers. But the flip side of that is it's a weak point in the system that's designed like that on purpose. So when you have a lot of friction in here, as well as due to age, these gear plugs can give way. And I think that's what's going on. Ford has used that design for many, many years, not the cable type of design, but as far as I can remember, they've used this kind of motor in various forms with the plastic gear plugs ever since the early 70s, but due to CAFE standards, they've had to lighten up the mechanism over the years. So they've got the same motor design basically, but had to go to this cable setup in the 90s versus the old steel regulator arm that would go up and down with a big clock spring on it. And just by looking at the design of this thing, you can kind of tell by listening to it what the problem might be. The problem is really only going to be one of several things. One problem could be that this plastic piece here can give way, but everything else remains intact, and that would make one kind of sound. You would actually be able to hear things sliding up and down and perhaps hitting various obstructions inside the door, but the glass not moving. And another failure mode of these things could be although more rare, is there's a plastic gear in here, driven by the motor, where the two ends of the cable terminate, and they wind up like on a spool. And if this plastic gear inside of here gives way and it no longer is able to retain the cable, you'll hear the cable kind of winding up and getting bound up inside the mechanism, and it's just a small steel cable, so you'll hear it starting to fray. It'll have a distinct sound. And then the other possibility would be, and which is the most common thing, is the plastic gear plugs in here give away, and that kind of sound is just the motor spinning with no torque being applied to any of the mechanism. So if you have a Ford, at least a 1995 or older, and you're having power window problems and it sounds like this, that's definitely the motor just freewheeling and not applying any torque to the rest of the mechanism. If you were to energize your power window motor and you heard what you thought was a bunch of marbles rolling around in a can or something, that would be the cable getting away and getting all bound up inside the mechanism and hitting various parts of the internal door structure. So just by listening to it, you can kind of get a good idea of what your problem is going to be, which allows you to purchase the right kind of parts ahead of time to do the job. And even if it's not the gear plugs, which I'm pretty confident that it is, I've always got this wrecked car over here I can borrow parts from. And I could have taken the motor out to do this. I could just swap motors, but that's going to be, I've already got the motors out of all the other doors, and I've started to on this one. What you have to do, basically, it's very easy, is remove these three T30 Torx bolts and disconnect your wiring harness, and the motor comes right out. But as you can see, because of the accident, there's no clearance. In fact, that motor is actually pushing through when the outer door got banged into. So I do want to get that motor out of here. It's just going to take a little bit more time. I'm going to have to finish peeling away this outer door skin, or maybe even cut out a section, or somehow get behind here and push this back out enough to get the motor out. But that's a lot more work than I want to do at this point in time, just to get this window fixed to the point where I can go ahead and roll it up and avoid getting water inside the interior. I'll just go ahead and use the OEM motor and repair it properly. And to get these door panels off, what you have to do, it's not too bad. You just need an assortment of screwdrivers, a Phillips screwdriver, and various sizes of standard screwdrivers. And then of course your T30 Torx to get the motor out. And you're going to have a Phillips screw right here. Then you're going to have another Phillips screw right behind here once you pop up this power window switch and door lock assembly. And then the door panel is just going to slip up, tilt up, and go out. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these off. You just want to be careful with this. There's a metal clip up here and a metal clip down there. And I would use a trim stick, but the trim stick just doesn't have enough rigidity to pop these off. This might take two hands, but you can kind of get a feeling for how this works. Yeah, that might take two hands. You can't pry too much with a screwdriver, you'll damage the interior, but as you can see, if you're gentle enough, you won't leave any indentations or anything in the plastic. You just have to be very careful. And these door panels are in bad shape anyway. You can kind of tell how worn they are. But you can kind of see that screw right there that we're right here that we need to get. So let me get this window switch mechanism out of here, get these two screws off, and we'll get the door panel out. Okay, now that we have the door panel off, to make it easier, we want to remove the speaker. And it's better to go ahead and remove the speaker plus the mounting bracket. So you want to hit these 3 screws on the outside. And then after that we'll take off this moisture barrier. It just peels off, but you want to be careful when you peel it not to stretch the plastic too much, because you want to get this thing back on. It's required to keep all the wiring connections dry, and as well as the inside of the door panel. And you can see how this panel comes off. It's pretty straightforward. I did forget to mention to take out that centerpiece. This centerpiece where the door handle is kind of hard to get off just from the outside. So it's usually better to get the door panel started off and kind of put some pressure on it from behind with your hand. At the same time you're working a screwdriver up in there, then it'll pop on off and give you the clearance you need to get the door panel off. And it basically just clips right on with these clips here, which always break. I've never seen a door panel on a Ford that didn't have one or more broken clips. This plastic just gets brittle over the years. Oops. Well, there's one more. You can see just how brittle that is. You should not be able to break this off with your hands. These door panels are the cheapest thing on the car, unfortunately. They're terrible. Terribly designed. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I've got to replace basically the entire interior on this car. It's because since this driver's door hinge is messed up and it's sagging, they kept slamming the door real hard, and the door panel is completely disintegrated because it just doesn't have the strength to do that. So that's definitely one area of the car that could use some attention. What they really should have done is, on the back side of these door panels, put maybe a galvanized piece of metal here or strips of metal to act as reinforcements instead of all this. Oh, that's broken too. Almost all this brittle plastic that just fails over the years. Never been a good fan of plastic on cars, but not really a whole lot we can do. So this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to get the speaker out of here and get this vapor barrier out of here, and then we'll be able to work with this motor. Okay, now that I got the vapor barrier peeled up enough, I've left it attached up here as much as I could. I just have it lifted up just enough to expose these T30 Torx bolts and the power connector. I've already got the power connector taken off. You just hold that out with your fingers and slide this out. They can be a little bit tough to get off if there's corrosion in there. And then we'll take our wrench and start backing these bolts off. They've already got the holes drilled in the inner door panel here, so you don't have to worry about finding the dimples and drilling the holes out. And as you're taking these out, you just want to get your hand back in here this way to grab that motor to keep it from falling out, and you'll be able to work it on out of there. Okay, now that we got the motor out, you can see all the corrosion that is built up on the cover here, which makes me very confident the problem is going to be inside this motor. There's one T20 Torx bolt right here that you need to take off, and then you want to pop this cover off gently, making sure not to damage the grease seal here. And I'm pretty sure what I'll end up finding once I get this thing off, I've already broken the bolt loose, I'll probably find a whole bunch of chewed up plastic gear plugs. This might take 2 hands. Yep. And that's exactly what happened. I think we're on the right track. Just want to work that off. Set that aside. I'm going to clean all this crud out of here, then I'll take out this gear, because what happened is that this plastic stuff gets all chewed up in the gears and starts creating a lot of wear. Then I'll repack everything in here with grease and go in with the new gear plugs. In this case, they came from Napa. I think Dorman also makes these, and they are $9. So this entire job, if I'm successful, is going to be about $9 and maybe an hour and a half worth of labor once I get all this stuff cleaned up and get this door put back together. So let me do that and I'll be right back. Okay, I've got all the parts cleaned up as best I can and all the chunks of those gear plugs out of the drive mechanism so they don't continue to churn and cause a lot of wear and everything. The little O-ring seal on here is nice and soft and in good shape, so that's good. And I've got this gear cleaned up as best I could. I just went through all the teeth and cleaned all the plastic chunks and old grease out of there. And then same thing with the output gear as well too. So all the parts are nice and clean. Now it's time to get these new gear plugs in here, and this is the part that's a bit of a pain in the ass because they're kind of hard. I mean, they have to have enough torque to get the window up and everything, but not so much that it can cut your finger off. And they didn't make it easy because these dimples in here, there's no rolled edge on here. It's still kind of sharp, so you kind of have to start at an angle and kind of get it like that, and then use your other finger to hold that glass plug in and kind of get it started, and then go ahead and put this thing in a vise and run it down. I might even try putting some grease on this to make it just a little bit easier and to avoid damaging these new plugs when I get them in. So I'm going to try to get this thing started, and then we'll go over to the vise. Another thing is these things tend to move around. There's nothing to hold them in place. You kind of have to have, 3 or 4 hands. But it can be done. It's just a little bit of trouble. And you've got several options. You don't have to do these repairs like this. They make these gear kits that already have the plugs and the drive mechanism built in, and I think they're about $25. These plugs, as I said before, are about $9 just for the plugs alone. And you can buy a whole new motor assembly anywhere from $35 to, I think, $60. And if you really wanted to splurge, you can get the entire regulator and motor assembly. A lot of people just go ahead and buy the motor assembly complete because it makes it a lot quicker to make the repair, but if you don't have that kind of money, you can get away with spending just $9 and a little bit of effort, and you'll get the same result. Plus you'll be left with a nice OEM motor versus the newer ones which have a plastic housing on there. Anyway, let's get this thing started and see what we end up with here. Okay, that worked out really well. It's about 5 minutes later and I have a complete assembly. Don't get frustrated by it. It is going to be tricky to get in here, but the method did work. I just used a little bit of grease, the same grease I'm going to use to lubricate the mechanism. It's just regular mildly fortified chassis grease. I like the synthetic kind. And just put a little bit on these 3 lobes on the metal piece here. Get 2 started at an angle and leave this last one for the vise. Invert it like that in the vise and get a little bit of pressure on it and start working that other part in there, and it'll reach a point where it'll go back in. These plugs seem like they're hard, but they're really not. They have a little bit of give to them, especially under the force of a vise, and you won't do any damage. It's not going to come out. It's in there pretty tight. This thing is ready to go back together just like that, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and lubricate the inner shell with some grease as well as the gear, and go ahead on with the reassembly here. Okay, here's what the initial pass of grease looks like. I got a big daub of it on the drive gear, on the worm gear, and then of course on the shaft sticking out. and a little bit in the housing. And you just want to pack it into the gear teeth just like you're packing a wheel bearing. You don't want to use too much grease. It's just going to create a lot of friction and make more work for the motor. There's no reason to grease the non-moving parts. So now this thing's ready to go back in. And what I like to do is I'll go ahead and run the motor with the cover off of it, and then take this back out and apply more grease if I need to. That way I know that I have just enough before I put the cover back on. Okay, now that we have a fully assembled and working and tested power window motor, it's time to go back into the car with it. Everything's all packed with grease and everything, and I got most of the rust off of it. We're gonna come in here and clean the mating surfaces up real good. Maybe put a little bit of grease in there. Marry the two pieces together and start reassembling everything. You can see how the cables are attached, hopefully, in there. But I'm going to try to clean as much of that off of there as I can and go back together with this thing. Okay, now that we have the door panel all put back together and everything all complete, it's time to go ahead and test this thing and see how it sounds. And now it runs all the way up to the stop where it's supposed to be, and the motor sounds nice and quiet. So it's hot out here. I'm going to go ahead and leave the window down. I went ahead and lubricated the track and everything to make it as easy on the motor as I can. So I call that a successful repair. And I can now roll down all my windows except for the rear passenger window. And I'm going to have to fix that on another project here, but basically here's the noise that it makes. It's basically bound up. So it looks like that might just be lubrication. And to lubricate that window track, basically all I had to do is just using this other one as an example. You can see where they lubricated it at the factory where this has gotten kind of waxy. I just lubricated this whole thing with a light film of grease in addition to the other side there, so that this mechanism up here can go down nice and smooth. But if any one of these systems fail and everything, because I've got the wrecked car still here and I'm taking parts off of it, I've got complete assemblies I can go on with and have this thing fixed in about a half hour, just changing out the motor. But I decided to go ahead and use these gear plugs and keep the original motor, both to show you guys, and also because getting the motor out of the wrecked door over there is going to take a lot longer than it would have getting it from the non-wrecked door. You can just see what a mess this makes when these gear plugs finally disintegrate. So it takes a little bit of time to do this particular repair and get all this stuff out of here, but definitely well worth it to do it like this. Do it yourself versus having to pay a shop to do it, which would charge quite a bit of money.